Thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday evening in the rain as well. So, welcome to Mental Health and Social Justice. Before we begin, I always like to explain kind of what the space is. The space today is a collaboration between Inspirited Minds, who are a mental health service, or rather a mental health charity. They work with Islamic counselors, they work with the Muslim community, trying to make it easier to access mental health services, mental health support, break the stigma. And now we're also collaborating on how justice, or rather injustice, impacts mental health, how it contributes to mental health issues, and also how we are kind of all operating under a system that does distress us. My name is Shamoly Hoque, and I have an organization called Hoque. That's a collaboration, and that came about after October 7th, 2023. I don't think I have to explain why we decided to gather after that date. But what we found is that there was a lot of people, there was a lot of big feelings, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of wanting to do something, but not necessarily the spaces of trust to come together, to collaborate, to better understand how the various parts of the system impact us as a community, and then build from there. So I really, really want to emphasize that this is a building space. It's not a lecture, it's not school. We will be referring to some academia, but it's more about these big topics can't be done in 3 hours. So it's somewhere to jump off from, and we always provide references. We also take a really collaborative approach. Part of this is trying to build a model with the community, ground up the lived experience, the thoughts that doesn't get funded for research, doesn't come up in academia, and just really centering the community in all of that. Usually we look at the problems from a wider lens, but also the socio-cultural. So where's our community at? What's going on? What's amiss? And it's about incorporating our Islam. And one of the key ways that we want to do that is as a support for each other. So there might be agreements, disagreements in the room, but we just ask that it's a reminder everything said is an amana, and to also, I guess, come in good faith with the conversations, with the comments. Having said that, I would like to introduce my co-facilitator, Ayo Khalil. He is a psychiatry resident doctor, currently working in a high-security forensic inpatient setting. What is that, Ayo? It's just words. What's a forensic inpatient setting?
Have any of you heard of Broadmoor Hospital at all? Yeah, if you just put your hands up. So essentially, I should say Assalamu alaikum, by the way, to all of you. Good to see you all here. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So essentially, Broadmoor is where people with mental illness or severe personality disorders, so we're looking at things like borderline personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, or mental illness like schizophrenia and other psychotic illnesses, who, when they have committed crimes or the level of violence that they are demonstrating is too high to be dealt with in a usual psychiatric hospital, they are sent to Broadmoor. So if you go on the internet, you will see all sorts of patients there who have done all manner of crimes, some of them quite famous. So it's a very high-risk environment. There's a high risk of being assaulted. There's a high risk of violence on staff and other patients. So it means that you have to be very much on your guard in that sense, but at the same time, it's supposed to be a rehabilitative environment for these patients. And it's quite a difficult balance because in your mind, you think someone's committed a crime such as murder, or even like, cannibalism, for example. We have people there who have done that, or assault. The general idea that society has is you should throw these people away and lock away the key, right? And throw away the key. When actually, when you look at their histories and their upbringings and their childhoods, very much started with violence, which led up to the violence they experience today. So my role in that is helping to rehabilitate those patients in a nutshell. Let me take it back.
Thank you. And I think this background is really going to come into the discussions we'll be having, the process of somebody who is a perpetrator, but also a lifelong victim. And what does that mean for their future? As well as when we look at wider society, and Islam as well, redemption, can you really just throw people into the fringes? And so that's Ayo. And Ayo has also done a lot of work in the community, particularly focusing on structural violence, racism, and Islamophobia. And he's the founding, this is still correct?
Yeah,
founding
yeah.
member of the UCL Sarah Parker Redmond Center for the Study of Racism and Racialization. So my background, I am a trainee forensic psychologist and a trauma-informed practitioner. I work with service users, so right now with men from the global majority. So a few things. When we say global majority, we are talking about, there's no white people in the room, basically what we all look like. And one of the reasons the language has changed from black and ethnic minorities, so minority ethnic, is worldwide we're not a minority. And minoritization is a process that is done to you. It's to make you the smaller group and then the biases that come about institutionally. So that's why we've moved away from that word and we use the term global majority. And when you are the subject of the institutions that are minoritizing you, that's when we may say racially minoritized. So I work with men from the global majority. And I guess a little bit later than when they would come across Ayo. I work in the more medium to high risk, and similarly, so much complex trauma. So I have service users who have done some crimes, maybe involved in gangs, but when they come my way, it's almost like they're stunted in those formative years as a child when they got involved. And prior to that, you'd hear all sorts of things like they grew up in care and there wasn't any support. And that's not even before you get to the state-based racism, the issues with the education system, poverty. And we work, so I'm quite lucky, alhamdulillah, I get to work in a way that it's, because it's specifically for the global majority, we get to be creative. So we can work with quite a decolonial lens and try and support, sometimes in the traditional ways of intervention, but other times in a way that is more suitable. And there's a lot of research, and we're going to really get into that about what is mainstream and who does that cater to, and then what does that mean as it trickles along. And I've already mentioned that I set up this organization 2023. So the first section will be a little bit more us talking at you. However, late after that, we're going to take questions and comments, and there's a wealth of knowledge in the room, so really like to do it like a back and forth, as I mentioned. So feel free, if at any point you need some clarity, pop your hand up. Don't worry about waiting. And just again, when it comes to questions and comments, please feel free to jump in. So mental health. I guess we wanted to define what mental health is usually known as, and in terms of services in the UK. We're in the UK, but sorry guys. Yeah, and within the NHS right now, which is the biggest provider of mental health services. So the two words mental health is the same as physical health. It doesn't really mean anything except our psychological, well-being or illness. It encompasses all that. Now, when we look at mental health conditions or illnesses, that's when someone would, want to go and seek support. And there's various diagnoses that's on there. We have diagnoses like generalized anxiety disorder, depression, phobias, OCD. Then there is also what was mentioned, psychosis, personality disorders. And mental health can also impact, so mental health conditions and illness can also impact without diagnosis. It's saying that 1 in 4 people have had suicidal thoughts. 1 in 10 people self-harm. 1 in 13 people have attempted suicide. And there's also many people who are not coming across services, and maybe they've not come to the point where they are seeking that support. So I always say take the numbers with a pinch of salt. And unfortunately, a lot of these numbers are even higher when it comes to the youth. So they're even higher. The World Health Organization states that globally, we have more than 1 billion people that live with a mental health condition. And they are saying that the priority is affordable, effective, and feasible strategies to promote, protect, and restore that mental health. So that kind of spectrum of a diagnosis does not mean that you're ill and that is it. That's what all of life is. Just like physical health, there's ways of managing, coping, and where you'd like to get to. And not having a diagnosis does not mean that you will never be impacted in that way. What I really want to go through within the field of mental health in particular is the trauma cycle. I think trauma is quite a popular word right now, very much online, a lot in pop psychology. I have to throw out the disclaimer, this is something, because it's going to contextualize much of what we discuss further, but this is just kind of touching on it. We're not training you on trauma cycles. And I say that because what we have is a lot of big conversations with layers impacting the most vulnerable, and then they're being had online in 90 seconds. We don't want to do that. But what I want to go through is how trauma affects the brain, the physiological that comes from when someone has had a traumatic experience. Does everyone have an idea of PTSD or complex trauma, what that is? Shall I go into a bit more depth? Go into it? So post-traumatic stress disorder is usually, you would get a diagnosis for it. It's when something has happened. The most research is on veterans, so ex-military. There's been an experience that has happened and it has caused a traumatic stress that stays with you, and then that can manifest in different ways. People may have seen in the films the sudden panic attack, or the I can't breathe right now. Complex trauma is slightly different in that it's something that builds up because of repetitive experiences. So the kind of still a traumatic experience, but it's repetitive over time. It could be in childhood, it could be as an adult, it could be relational. And again, I want to say this is like a very, very brief simplifying of what trauma is. Now, when someone is in a traumatic state, our brain is built for survival, not thinking. That's one of the things, and we always say about think it through, rationalize. The brain's primary function before rationalizing and logic is to keep you alive, it's to survive. When someone has been impacted by trauma, when that experience comes back to them, because of the way memory has been stored, it's real. Their body, physiologically, and their brain is in survival. It's not a case of, oh, this isn't happening. For them and the brain itself, that's what the nervous system, this is happening, I need to keep myself alive, I need to keep myself okay. Or we go into what is called the amygdala, so at the bottom there, which is the survival brain or the chimp brain, that is known as. There is things that can be done, and that's where trauma therapies, or we call it a window of tolerance, which is essentially supporting, whether through therapy or just general coping skills and building a particular type of trauma-informed resilience to bring you back into your prefrontal cortex. So that's the one that thinks, that's the one that survives. I'm sorry to break it to you, this one is where you're acting from way more than this one. And so this is really important to understand, because there's some trauma reactions we see, and I am sure you see like a lot of anger, distress that is pathologized or seen as an illness and something negative, and the fact that it is just a very physiological reaction is overlooked and it's not worked from that space. And you will see this a lot when people are working with refugees and immigrants, and also the pathologizing of what they call emotionally unstable personality disorder, which has a higher number of diagnoses for women, and interestingly for men, antisocial personality disorder is higher. Forgot where I'm at. So do you want to add anything once I remember where I'm at?
Yeah. So in clinics, the clinics I've worked in, so I've worked in an outpatient sort of community clinic. I've worked in a crisis team as well, and I've worked in a psychiatric hospital, acute hospital. And PTSD, I think, is just one of the most destructive mental health illnesses that you can find in that. So characterized by three sort of main symptoms: hypervigilance or hyperarousal. So that feeling of constantly buzzing, your body's constantly on edge. Avoidance, so avoiding certain situations or stimuli that remind you of that situation that you were in. And then the last one, which is the one that people usually can relate to the most, is flashbacks. It can be flashbacks, nightmares, and this or remembering. And this remembering is not it's not something that you do voluntarily. It's something that happens without you wanting to do it. And I think particularly I have one case which I don't think I'll ever forget it, to be honest with you. And, when I see the rhetoric around asylum seekers and immigrants at the moment, it just disgusts me seeing this kind of rhetoric when I've actually, we've been in positions to treat these very people that are being demonized, right? So from a certain country, I don't want to make it too identifiable, but an individual from a North African country was over here. He was homeless, and he had PTSD, and he was tortured by his government in his country. And they tortured him and they electrocuted him. And one of the things about PTSD is that when you are having a panic attack or a flashback, the body can react in the same way as how it did when the torture was actually happening. So we saw him outside on the field so he was given a few days stay in a hotel in the local area that we were in, and they kicked him out because it'd been paid for only 3 days he had, and now he'd been kicked out. So we saw him outside on the grass. So very sort of strange setup, not in a clinic room, not in someone's house, literally on the grass with a translator. And when we tried to talk to him about what he suffered, his body started to remember. And his hands were like this, right? Literally contractions like this, both hands. And he was drooling, salivating so much he could not control himself. His body had lost control and he was crying. And it was literally as if he was being electrocuted in front of our eyes. And I remember this was when I was working with crisis team. The way mental health systems really box in your ability to help others. So, I looked at his case before I saw him and I said, this guy needs housing help. He needs, help with his visa. He needs help with immigration. He needs long-term counseling. And, basically the managers are telling me, well, all we can do is give medication. So I'm going to him and I'm like, I can offer you an antidepressant. And he looked at me and he said, is that all you can do for me? And it's like when people are suffering, when it comes to mental health, it's often not just mental suffering, it's multifaceted, like we've been talking about, it's social. If he was living somewhere before, but they put them in these HMOs of 9-10 other people who they don't know. Some of them may be doing, drugs, and those people are not getting the help that they need, to help them with their addictions. And putting loads of traumatized people and mentally unwell people in one place can be really triggering, right? So we look at our structures and our systems, and it's now become so boxed in, categorized that, okay, he's under the mental health services, we give him medication, we'll refer to all these other services who it's their problem now for them to sort that out and to get in touch with them. And we can't take that route anymore. Mental health is so multifaceted. There's the physical side, there's the spiritual side, which today's services again have just completely discounted, right? And that's not how it always used to be. We'll go into a bit more, but psych used to be the study of the soul. But as these fields have been secularized, the care has also been secularized as well. So that's just something I wanted to say on that.
We're going to go into it later, but I guess that's why we wanted to start with the trauma cycle, because we'll start with the individual, but we need to expand it. What's happening in mainstream services and under mental health is, one, compartmentalizing, and two, we are expected to look at a person and that's it. They're the problem and they're the solution, and everything else is omitted. So that's one example, and that, unfortunately, is a common example. Maybe not exactly that, but when we have an overlap with homelessness and varying mental health issues, not just one, family, pro-social supports, a lack of community, and trauma, when we look at and kind of the lens we're going through is the systematic abuses. So when it comes to injustices, is it the individual that is cause and solution, or actually is it when we look at the wider society that is cause and solution and which needs to get fixed first? And so kind of mentioned about what this means for our marginalized communities. But what I want to also hone in is sometimes we are seeing the most vulnerable and marginalized here. That structure of violence, so that roof goes over all of us. So whilst we had this poor soul, traumatized, no appropriate support, removed from everything he knew, and I'm not even going to go into why did he have to come to this country in the first place. It's our government's fault. So all of this history, now he's under the structure of violence, and he's got no access to care. And I used to get this a lot of, why do I work with prisoners? They've done a crime, criminal offending, worst thing you can do. Except there is a process of criminalization that happens through services where somebody is not allowed redemption. And so I've done a crime, I'm done. I've come to you now, Shamoly, therapy's great, and now I don't want to do anything more. What they're most likely, I'm going to be honest, what they're met with next, and it can be quite, I think as a practitioner, a little bit, sometimes you get stuck as well. Like, are you being complicit? A job, a house, a family. They are core needs. They're met with this inability to go and find a job because of the criminal record. And sometimes we think about, criminal record, worst thing ever. The truth is, it could have been a non-violent crime, but because of that record, they cannot go into work. So it's the very preventative factor that can support redemption. And those notions and that structure of violence, that same theme, we now see in the media narrative with refugees and immigrants. They don't want to work. Refugees and immigrants aren't allowed to work, by the way, guys. Like, they're not. They do not have benefits. It used to be around £36 a month they get, and they are not allowed to work. So if you come here as a refugee, you can want to build something for yourself. You're not allowed to do that. But I also want to preface, the UK owes the whole world everything, so people don't have to work. And then let's go down a little bit further. I don't have mental health. I haven't committed crime. But I've got really bad physical health issues. I've got sciatica. I need to get my checks done. Who here thinks they go and get seen through ER quickly? Exactly. So the same defunding that's happening over here of those that are criminalized, those that do not have access to care, not allowed to work under this little roof, is the same value system that is making ER waiting times much longer. The same value system why you can't get a GP appointment quickly. And the same value system that actually, if we carry on, going down to education, where our teachers are expected to be everything, but they're not paid properly, they don't have the required breaks. And when I mean breaks, I'm not talking about the school holidays, I'm talking about like the mental faculties and capacity of when you impinge on someone. And then they've got their mental health issues, and now we're back here. So I really, really wanted to, because sometimes I think we detach from our vulnerable and our marginalized. Ideally, we want to come with empathy in the first place. They are our own, we care. But at the same time, if you want to analyze it, it's the same roof that's on fire, and we're in the smoke, wherever you're out there. So now moving on to social justice. That's the background. What does social justice mean? The first thing, I've kind of touched on structures of violence, but social justice is a very simple definition. Again, please take this with a pinch of salt. We make our own definitions, but it's a place to start. It is justice in the terms of distribution of wealth, opportunities, privileges within a society. That's really important, within a society. What we see happening, not just in mental health, and I hope we've got it across that actually when you take a holistic approach, mental health, illness, distress, it's kind of in all our spaces to some extent, as well as healing is in all our spaces, or can be. So when we look at social justice, and the reason we wanted to use this example of mental health is because where you see it at the worst end there. And mental health is a very popular topic right now. The responses that are coming into that, though, is to an extent at times mirroring the secular world. Because what we're doing, again, is putting the individual as the problem, and that this individual needs a diagnosis to move forward. personally, maybe that individual needs a job that allows them to pay their rent. And so what does it mean to come into this intersection, so this kind of interlinked part of social justice and mental health? And we really want to get to clarity. I think that's the main thing. If we can move forward with that, then that's the starting point. So intersectionality, what that means is it was popularized by Kimberly Crenshaw, right?
Crenshaw, yeah.
Yeah, Crenshaw. It's diversity, equality, and inclusion. I'm presuming for those of us that work, that department is in your organization, and it's probably not very good. It's usually very tokenized, so it's kind of like, okay, you're brown, you're hijabi, let's celebrate Eid. That's examples that comes to mind. You got an example? That's it.
Probably on Black History Month, Black History Month, maybe they'll order some jollof rice, that's something. And then the box has been ticked after that, so.
That's the one. And with diversity, equality, and inclusion, I think one of the best examples of how bad it is, we saw is after October 7th and the current genocide going on. There's been a lot of reports, there's been a lot of research, I think both of us work in advocacy on that area, of people being impacted by Islamophobic colleagues, Islamophobic rhetoric, by just, even when you're not impacted by that, kind of having to face this big collective trauma that's on one part of the ummah, and then that is also trickling down and having an impact on your day-to-day mood. And most organizations did not tackle that. Or worse, they tried to make a victim out of Israel. That is, again, within that structure of violence, a type of emotional violence. So we would actually disclose what we mean by all of this violence. Because I know violence, you're usually thinking like a punch around the face, but what it means in this context. So Kimberly Crenshaw came up with a model of intersectionality, which looks at not separating all the varying parts of your identity. So it's not woman, black, man, whatever it may be. It's looking at how there are various aspects of our identity. And if we are truly working in what would be called a diverse and equal and inclusive way, first thing is to understand someone's experiences from those varying identities and how they kind of overlap with each other. And then in addition to that, what might form that identity? So systematic issues. We've mentioned kind of the experience of immigration, relationality. So we've got examples of somebody that may be from the global majority, but they're working in an all-white area, or they're a student in an all-white area. That's not necessarily the issue, but then they also have to experience a lack of belonging. So there's personal contextual factors as well, and then there's the isms. So that's kind of intersectionality in a nutshell. Does anyone have any comments, questions, anything of clarity, or we're good? Now we take that intersectional lens to a structure of violence. We're going to define it. And as you can see, there are a few layers. Violence is defined by physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill somebody. That's one definition, it's not the only definition. The secondary part of the definition of violence is the strength of emotion of a destructive natural force. So violence can be that which is, but that also that which threatens. And I guess that's why now when we look at domestic violence, we're looking a lot more about emotional abuse. So that's that which removes safety. Structural violence is when this comes about in our institutions, where they may not be bombing us directly, but there are things, and it's usually invisible, it's a lot more invisible than it is visible, that trickles down and impacts communities in a way that does impact life, and even actually impacts the length of life. Stress has been found to remove years off your life. And that conversation is had a lot around personal stress, look after yourself, get healthy, do all those things, by the way, guys. Like, don't be like, okay, this is it, it's the system, I won't look after myself. But the stress of current times that we're living in, that's not mentioned. The stress of weathering a community down. So weathering is the process of literally where you wear something down. There has been research now that it can contribute to physiological diseases, autoimmune diseases. And I want to take it back to, I'm going to use an example of a service user, and again, why it's not just the individual. So I've got my service user. He happens to live in an area where it's ghettoized and there's more gangs as a result. That said service user goes to prison. He has a child. The purpose of prison is loss of liberation. It's not supposed to be anything beyond that. And I think as Muslims, we also need to ask ourselves of when we feel a little bit too gratified at punishing a prisoner. Because sometimes there is that stigma as well. Because the purpose of prison, and this is by law, is the loss of liberation. Except now what we have is he's in prison. His wife's not done anything, his kid's not done anything. That child still has a right to family life to see his father. The prison decides they are going to remove him out of the area he stays in. Now there's a cost for the child to see his father, both in time, both in money. Then we have this child who's now been separated from his father, and that's going to have an impact as well. If we look at attachment theory. So as you can see, there's this one person, and the system is that, okay, this is the one person that needs help, but they've done wrong. But it spreads out just like that, and it weathers down. And then beyond this, I'm talking from the point of view of where if they did do that crime, majority of the time, either they didn't do it. We actually have political prisoners in the UK because of Palestine. So there are many times where either someone didn't do the crime, it wasn't there is nothing for public safety for them to be in prison. And I know I keep on talking about this is a mental health, I'm talking about crime, but the overlap is so huge that we can't not understand one to not understand the other. So that's your structural violence. That's your systemic violence and how it goes down and impacts somebody. Then we have institutional violence. So institution is kind of still within that system, but it's in our institutions. Workplace is the most obvious one. And also the other way, actually, the service user that comes into the institution, but work is one I think many people can relate to. And then we have community violence. So that kind of comes within that, and we've got a full section on that. And then it's individual violence. It's really important to kind of see that, because when we are looking to redress that, that's what we want, right? Islam came as a benefit to mankind. We want better for all, and we want better for civic society. When we decide that we're going to participate in that journey, and that collective journey, we will do it a little bit opposite. It's a little bit of the individual, because that feels easier. That feels a little bit in our control. But actually, no matter how much you strengthen individual point, if the system is still impinging, we will continue facing those problems, and that weathering will continue. And there will be new victims every single day. And within that, what I want to discuss is also the knowledge to then counter the structural violence. And going back to what we mentioned of, you guys would get these slides, by the way, so you'd get all the notes. There is a great reference. There's one article I advise everybody to read. It's the Institution of Racial Relations. Because I think right now, what we probably have, in terms of this literature, the best literature is race literature, critical race theory, or just looking at things through a racial lens, because it covers so much. I am going to quote Dr. Tariq Younis. He discussed in this article the idea of psychologization. So it's a frame which psychologizes social and political issues. And it's a key component in everything mentioned. What you're doing is pathologizing distress. A very real problem, a very fair reaction, and now you're going to pathologize this into a diagnosis. And we do mirror that. So I'm going to throw a question out there, because I think for this, one of the responses that has come about and been popularized is Islamic psychology, the field of Islamic psychology. However, it can operate in a secular framework. We can mirror that. Islamifying something or throwing the word Muslim in doesn't remove that potential. I do want to kind of preface this with, we're not cancelling anything. Please seek the support if you need. And the critique comes from a space of care, because if we don't address this, it's just 10, 20 more years of we're doing the same thing in the hijab. And what's come about when we discuss Islamic psychology is we understand the soul. So many of these things go back to the soul, a cleansing of the soul, diseases of the heart, but not quite in the way that Ayo mentioned at the beginning. In our traditions, it was a holistic framework. And even mental health, it wasn't compartmentalized into a separate topic. It was societal, it was communal, it was systemic. And when we're discussing diseases of the heart as a remedy, if we're only working on our individual heart and the nafs, because this is what you see, and do get the support, again, not saying don't, but the question has to be asked, what heart that is in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his path can just kind of cleanse its own self to well-being, but his neighbor is bruised and battered? The diseases we're seeing are actually communal, and it's something that we don't want to address. And we can also be complicit. We can be complicit in our organizations. We can be complicit in our work. We can come out with the most amazing Islamic reference. And I pray that Allah makes us sincere and He guides us and He makes us steadfast. It's not doing away with anyone's work, but we have to hold up that mirror, because what we sometimes do is, instead of pathologizing distress, we nafsify distress. Like, that's it. That one person, and overlook everything else. Even though we actually have a duty. The vulnerable person, those of us that are in the position of privilege, have a duty to them more than they have a duty to us. And not more than, I can't say that. But in terms of just the power dynamic of what we can do.
I think one of the things that really chimed with me is that how our communities, Muslim communities namely, can be complicit in these structures of violence. And I want to make it a bit personal, just because I think there's often a lot of benefit that can be taken from you guys and also for me when we have that personal exchange with each other. So for those of you who don't know, I myself am a convert. So the thing is, we're in 2025. It's about almost 9 years now. I've been Muslim. And I actually started off in secular social justice movements. So the leftist movements, that's where I sort of was finding my feet. And I remember on July 5th, 2016, a black man in America called Alton Sterling was shot in the back whilst being sort of wrestled to the ground by the police. He was unarmed and he died. And I watched this, and myself being black as well, this was something, you know, I could really relate to, having been stopped and searched myself, having been, you know, having feeling the boot of the system on my neck in that sort of sense. The next day, a man called Philando Castile died. That was, I believe, 6th of July, 2016. And that was on Facebook Live, and his daughter was in the back seat, and his daughter was crying after he'd been shot by police at a traffic stop. Again, he was unarmed, and he bled out on Facebook Live. And I remember the proximity of those two events. I was one of those people before, maybe you'd call me apolitical, maybe you'd call me just one of those people who just wanted to put their head down, but I feel like the proximity of those events really radicalized me. It really woke me up. And since that day, I was like, I have to do something. So I went from movement to movement, Stand Up to Racism, Socialist Worker Party, the Labour Party, any party, any group, you know, leftist group, I was there, you know, and I was really looking for a way to bring about justice on the earth. And actually, when I look back at it, I was also looking for some spiritual healing and some spiritual stability, not just in myself, but in the world as well, right? Because I feel like so much sickness that we see in people today is not just because of, you know, and the way, for me, it's quite tricky as a psychiatrist today, because often the way we do our formulations or the way we do our diagnosis, the diagnosis makes it very much a diagnosis on the person. We do obviously talk about the history of the person, you know, their substance use history, their personal history, their family history. But the diagnosis just seems to be for the person. And we look at the person as being sick, when actually society is sick. Look at the amount of homeless people we have in society. Look at the amount of poverty we have in society. Look at the amount of corruption we have in our governments and the people that are supposed to be leading us. Look at the amount of greed, monetary greed in our societies. You know, pollution, all these kind of things that are feeding into us. You know, it's a constant exchange between the individual and the communal. So for me, I was always looking for, I guess, some spiritual connection. And so eventually, through my own readings, some people have been asked, did you convert to Islam because of a girl, like, or something like that? It's a common question, you'd be surprised. It's a common question. You know, people ask those questions, or even, was it in prison, for example, right? Yeah, so those are some things that comes up, right? But actually, there are a multitude of people in this day and age, and we've seen it with the genocide that's been happening in Gaza, that actually come into Islam because they want justice. And we look at the things we've done over this time. We have lobbied our governments. You know, we have protested day and night. People have gotten themselves arrested. They've chained themselves to buildings. They vandalized buildings. People have got themselves fired from work. And these governments and institutions have continued to fund the genocidal regime and the genocidal state of Israel. And we get to a point where, and this is the point I got to, that we do all these things and nothing is changing. There has to be something more, right? There has to be a greater sense of justice, right? There has to be another way to be able to attain justice. Because if we can't get it in this life, there needs to be another place that we can get it. And for me, that was very much so. I think everybody connects to faith in a different way. For some people, it's the love of Allah. For some people, it's the mercy of Allah. For me, it's Allah's justice. You know, I actually grow in Iman when I read about the hadiths about the day of judgment. You know, some people think that's kind of odd because it's like those are very scary things. But for me, it affirms my faith that those evil people and the evil things that have been done, these systems that are disadvantaging people because it's profitable, you know, Allah's justice is all encompassing and it will come for them. And for me, I feel like that's what ended up bringing me towards Islam, you know. And I think with all of these systems that all of us are under, you know, we've talked about, you know, institutional violence, structural violence. The ways it can look like is, you know, not being able to have access to good housing. You know, I've lived in housing with mold in it. You complain, no one does anything about it. And the rents are going up. And we saw the repercussions of that in COVID. 75% of so-called ethnic minorities in London live in overcrowded housing. That proved to be fatal during COVID, right? So all of these inequalities that we experience actually becomes a matter of life and death. Overcrowding before, people would have just said, okay, you're not living in nice conditions, but overcrowding housing and poor ventilation, which is another thing we are more likely to experience, it contributed to death. I think in the first wave of the pandemic, the highest death rate was for Black people, 4 times higher than their white counterparts. And in the second wave, it was Asians. They usually say Pakistani and Bangladeshi, which to be honest is coded for Muslim, in my opinion, because they put Indians to the side and it's Pakistani and Bangladeshi. You know, they 5 times higher than their other counterparts. That's what poverty does. That's what inequality does. And it's on all of us to be able to mobilize. So when we think about mental health, like I remember in crisis teams so many times, you know, I'd be seeing people who are depressed. And when I look at why they're depressed, you know, they don't have adequate housing. Some of the houses I've seen, you know, mold is growing, they don't have proper flooring, they don't have hot water. You know, that is going to affect you, right? And I'm very big on not just giving a pill, like not just giving just a medication, just to wipe away your problems, because it's often not going to do that. What are your social supports like? You know, some people are estranged from their families, for example, because of violence, domestic violence or physical violence they face as a result at the hands of people that are supposed to protect them, right? One thing in the Muslim community is that, unfortunately, and I've seen this with my own eyes, is that at large, the Muslim community generally protects those who have done the abusing, actually. And that's one of the things we need to be honest about. So when you're talking about being complicit in these systems of violence, actually, you know, we are not necessarily saying people in this room, but as a wider community, this is happening. We don't take domestic violence seriously. You know, just bear it at home, you know, for the sake of the family, for the sake of the kids. You know, just bear with it, just keep on with it, just don't talk about it. You know, you don't want to bring shame or embarrassment on the family while people are going through very real hurt and pain, right? So we need to become custodians of justice. Mental health and spiritual health are inextricably linked. They're linked together. We need to become the custodians of justice, and that means challenging systems. And in my opinion, systems are built up from individuals. And that feeds into the last thing I'll say is that I think it's a verse in the Quran where it says, Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change their own condition. Why? Because the individual and the communal are linked. We feed into each other, right? A community is made up of individuals. So us as individuals, we all in our every aspect of our lives need to be the one spearheading, an improvement in these systems, an improvement in our mental, our spiritual health. And last thing I'll say is, you were talking about how Muslims are replicating secular ways of operating. And I think now, when we look at, in the Muslim community, what does it mean to be successful? I get so many ads on my social media. Do you want to earn, outside of your halal income, outside of your 9 to 5? Stop doing your 9 to 5 and come and trade and come and do this and come on my course and come and all of these things. And it's like now the picture of success is like how wealthy you are. I've seen there's like a dawah to trade in pipeline that I'm telling you, it sounds like a joke, but this is something I've actually seen. You go from giving reminders and it's like, okay, if I need to really be successful in life, suddenly I need to be trading and earning 6 figures. And I've treated people, by the way, who follow those courses and follow that advice and it doesn't go well for them. I know someone who put tens of thousands of pounds, right? And it broke him, when it didn't, these people have responsibility for what they're doing. So-called leaders, when these investments don't work out, this advice that is given doesn't work out, it does have repercussions. So we need to restructure. What does it mean to be successful? Does it mean I need to be earning 6 figures? Does it need to mean, I need to have this much Bitcoin or this much crypto, or working for this company? Now you see some Muslims walking about like, okay, I work for Deloitte, I work for whatever corporate company, and I'm the bee's knees, right? But spiritually, where is your heart at? Are you helping the downtrodden in your communities, right? The people who have been abused, not just giving a little bit during, the last 10 days of Ramadan, because that's the intention that actually is that it's for you. What initiatives are you helping? A lot of Muslims are flocking to Dubai now. A lot of them are flocking to Dubai.
No one here, we boycott.
Exactly. We should be boycotting these things. Well, a lot of Muslims are flocking to Dubai for hijrah. What kind of hijrah is this? So for me, when I converted to this faith, I really wanted it. Maybe I expected more. After I read the Quran, I thought this is a perfect book. Naively, I thought the people would be perfect. Right? I know that was naive now looking back at it. But I feel like we have, when I looked at so many religions, I looked at all over society, and I hadn't found something that speaks to you and is so nourishing and also so empowering as the Quran, and we don't use it. And for me, that is just such a waste. And I wish we could do better. I wish, it's my deepest wish on this earth that we could just do better with the faith that we've been given. Yeah, Jazakallah.
I think that kind of really brings us home on this section. And I'll be honest, like when we were doing this, it was like, okay, what are the expectations? It's mental health. Everyone usually comes and they want to know the 5 ways to well-being and the medicine. But I really, really hope that, at least for the first part, we're opening our mind up a little bit more. As well as Islam gives us something that actually a lot of sections of society don't have, which is the values of care, the values of change.
Yeah.
So if we talk about looking at what success is and isn't, and if we're going to start from civic society up, i.e. strengthen the community, change from there. So for me, it's a case of always, okay, change from the community, challenge the system. That's a 2-prong. We have those values, those care, and how to cultivate that community. The question is now, do we go about doing it? And it's not all doom and gloom. I think that's really important. The reason we discuss the collective so much is because it is a social burden. It's not supposed to fall on individual shoulders and wear out our people. Like, that's what's not supposed to happen. It's collective resilience building. That's what we want to, inshallah, get towards. So I think we're going to take some questions and comments, a short break, and then we're going to come back where we're going to delve a lot more into how it manifests in our community, but also roles, what we can do. Does anyone have any questions and comments? Anyone they want to contribute? Anything they want to ask about all that's been said so far?
You go on.
Go on, sister.
Bismillah, go ahead, please.
One of the things, so a lot more of this, where you meant the faults of the individual connected to the top, will come out later. My response to that, and I'm going to ask for Ayo's thoughts as well, is you support the individual with kind of the same values of why we want the system taken down. What I mean by that is, so if we are like, why not just live under structural violence? It's not impacting us, right? We could take that tack, but we don't want to do that because we believe in justice and empathy. So similarly, I would say it's that same path, but you're just individualizing it a little bit. So you're bringing it home to that individual person of not leaving them alone to deal with it. The other thing I would say, please, please, please seek your support when supporting another. We have this really bad trait within our community sometimes where it falls on one person who's the carer, and carers have a really high rate of suicide. That's something. So just like you want to support that person, yourself as a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, go and take your rights from where you need. Gauge the support. And one of the reasons we keep saying systems and organizations, so let's say Inspirited Minds, someone needs help, myself and I were training, and there's a lot of people in the room that are trained as well. There's a reason you get trained. There's a reason we go to professional support. So for the individual, this is not to say don't get help. Please, if you need therapy, do it. Two things can exist at the same time. We want to challenge the system, but that doesn't mean, because of everything that I've said, doesn't mean that people shouldn't have support or we can't get therapy. So do that in that way, I would say. And obviously, without knowing the exact case, that would be my suggestion for it. And just with the same kinds of, and I think love for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He guides a lot when you do something from there, but don't kill yourself doing it. That's why we want to fix. That's why we want to fix the top bit.
A few years ago, I used to think everyone has to be at the front leading the protest or leading the initiative. But it doesn't have to be like that. If you're good at administration skills and organizational skills, I'm quite terrible personally. I struggle even with like Google Sheets, but I've met some people who are amazing at that. And that really brings projects together, is the administration side, because I've seen so many projects come together and then dissipate because nobody is keeping it together and keeping on top of things. And that may seem like, oh, it's just a bit of a small, literally things can, you say, oh, yeah, we're gonna meet on this date, no one chases it up, you never meet, the initiative never comes together, right? So that is one thing. Volunteering your time, for example, I know Inspirited Minds, they have volunteers who answer phone calls, you get training to be able to do that. Volunteering your money if you have it, right? Giving your wealth to charities. And I think something we also need to be doing is, I think foreign charities is really important to causes around the world, but we do also have problems in the UK as well. So supplementing charities of our money here. Even doing things like if you want to help with people in poverty, there are food banks. I think there's one called Sifra Kitchen, I believe, in northwest London. So there's one like that. You can volunteer at soup kitchens, right? It's finding a way that how can I really be resourceful and use my time. Like I know people who have built websites for others. I know people who have catered for events, for example. Every single person in this room has some sort of skill which can be used amazingly. And if we all put those things together, it can really embellish whatever project we put our minds to. So that would be my advice. And similarly, just to echo off what you've said, like I think I personally went through a stage where like I would spend only sleeping hours at home. I was out here, there, everywhere doing something. And I think something about this system is that it constantly keeps you working, it constantly keeps you exhausted. And people who are constantly working and constantly exhausted do not have the mental, emotional, or spiritual capacity to organize against the things that are subjugating us. And I think something which is just really, really important is taking time, just for example, to just sit with the Quran, whether it be the English or the Arabic, by the way, something that you can really connect with, listening to an Islamic lecture. And again, it doesn't need to be something academic, just something that, I love Suleiman's lectures. There's also a couple, Dr. Sherman Jackson, Sheikh Ubadullah Evans from America, And maybe for you sisters, like listening to like a female sheikh as well, who can understand your experience. For me, sometimes I like to listen to black scholars who can understand my lived experience, and connect me to faith. Our faith is one of doing, and I think everybody here, there's no excuse for us at all for not to be able to do anything in our lives with our skills we have. I know everyone here is skilled, so that would be my contribution, inshallah.
There's one thing I just want to add on to that, and make it easier for each other to do. Because I know it's quite easy for me to say, please seek support, let's get vulnerable, whatnot. But we know there is a stigma. And sometimes, especially with mental health, it's like, or criminal offending, everything we've been discussing, it's this big bad, this, it's your neighbor, but it's this boogeyman, this ooga booga over there. I need to keep it at arm's length. So for us as well, I hate the word normalize, but yes, like make it easier. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has told us Islam is easy. He wants ease for us. So let us at least make it easier for each other in the small ways we can, but then also remembering that ultimately we are the effort, He is the outcome, and Allah guides whom He wills. Is there anybody else that wants to add anything? When you understand the structures and system, tell me if I'm right, you can have compassion and empathy for somebody, but when you understand that, you can really empathize and come with it with a different lens. And I know definitely the last 15 years has really kind of my career, not just impacted by a career, but definitely life and how I engage with those around us. So we'll take a 15-minute break, guys. The second section as well, we really want to discuss about actually what are those roles? Like how do we come together? Because that's sometimes a little bit missed. Like let's get motivated, let's do, but actually what does that look like? So 8:15, if you guys want to help yourself to tea, a break, fresh air, and then we're going to come back. A few people have asked how can you get the slides, as well as further contact details. I promise I will detail it all at the end. One thing behind me right now, though, just a couple of questions as we continue working, and I want to reiterate that we really want to make this communal. So there's no right or wrong answer, right or wrong comment, whatever you're coming to this space with, it's been set up so we can reflect together and work through that together, inshallah. So the couple of questions that just to keep in mind generally, you can take a picture if you want, and we will get the slides to you as well, is what might be some real life examples of intersectional needs that I've missed. So that might be in work. I know we've got some practitioners or those that are going into the field. And again, it's not just mental health. I know we have teachers, students, whichever side you are, or even in family, what needs might I be missing? What's the blind spot that I can support with? And what structures of violence am I operating in? And I really want us to do that not from a place of blame, but when we recognize something, then we can start taking further steps. So what we're going to look at now is communal justice. I think when we were discussing this, Ayo and I, and trying to work out how we're going to go about it, and how we, tackle and then move towards some form of collective unity and movement, it felt a disservice if we don't talk about intra-communal justice. So what is happening in the community right now that's really fragmenting us, that to some extent is causing harm as well. And I put the ayah up there, oh, you believers, stand firm for justice as witnesses for Allah, even if it is against yourselves, your parents, or close relatives. Be they rich or poor, Allah is best to ensure their interests, so do not let your desires cause you to deviate from justice. And what I want to kind of like a disclaimer preface this, because I think sometimes what happens with the community, especially when there's so many external attacks, and not just external attacks, we are weaponized. So I'm a Muslim woman. One thing we know that a Western feminist loves to do is how they're going to save the oppressed brown woman. It was in Iraq, it's in Palestine, it's in Kashmir. I support a Kashmir project, regularly weaponized. Sometimes I feel that we go to the other side of we want to pretend that we don't have the issues that we do. If we're talking about keeping it within the community, then that's for goals of accountability and restorative justice and stopping harm. If harm has been caused, then there is no keeping it in the community. Now we are active participants in being unjust to our own ummah. And I refer you back to the ayah. We're going to discuss two key examples. I'm going to pass it over to Ayo. There's a lot. We've kind of already touched on stigma You know, there's a lot. The intersectionality also actually exists within the group. It's not just the wider system, but within the group as well. But the two examples that really, really stand out right now is the red pill discourse online and anti-blackness. And what I want you to keep in mind is we have these conversations and it's a back and forth. So please, when we have the comment section, if there's something that comes to your mind and you're like, you know what, I feel like the room needs to know this, we need to be aware of it. And if there's something that you're like, I had a good experience, I tried this and it was effective, throw it into the pot. Within this, what I'd like you to keep in mind is the power dynamics again. We've spoken about power in terms of institutional to individual, and within the community, there are those power dynamics. So, because I hear a lot of, especially in red pill discourse. So for those that don't know and who are lucky to not know, red pill discourse is prominent men who have a large following, but their target is always women. So their target is always punching down to the next vulnerable group. And the cover-up is, well, we're critiquing and this is true. Critique can be true, and I'm going to provide some questions at the end to help us assess this. But i.e. critique, even if the words are Islamically correct, can be of detriment. Not only can they be of detriment, you can be a propagator of harm. And that's what we need to, again, it feels like sometimes, why are we talking about this? And it feels like, and I feel it too, like 20 years later, 30 years, 40 years, we're here, the cycles continue, we're actively seeing a genocide. But I know definitely one consolation for myself is we are where we are. So we can be like, okay, well, the Muslim Ummah, that's where we are, that's who we are. Or we can say, this is where we're at, how do we build? We can also do our part. In a little bit of a selfish way, on the day of Akhirah, we're going to be judged on our part. But beyond that, in this room, and I've had a few people come up and say, so, what do we do? And we're going to speak about that at the end. And also, but the wider community. And, we're not getting any traction. We've got all these issues. But change has to start somewhere. And that's how it is. And it's always parallels because, alhamdulillah, only 2 years ago when I started this event, the amount of effort to try and get half this room full. So that is still traction. So I want us to keep those things in mind. And again, please don't be shy to throw your comments in. So Ayo, I'm going to pass it to you now.
Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good to be back. I had that urge to be like, can I hear a loud Assalamu alaikum? I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna resist that urge.
Do it.
No.
It's tradition. Can we get a proper walaikum salam?
All right, can I get a proper Assalamu alaikum? Thank you very much. Yeah. Alhamdulillah. So I think we're looking at communal justice. This is something I've been really ruminating a lot recently. What does it mean? What does communal justice mean? What does it mean to be in community with one another? And I think there is a hadith that comes to mind that I remember when I was reading about Islam, this was a really illuminating hadith for me, and it was you're not a true believer until you want for your brother, but you can also take it as your sister or as another person, what you want for yourself. Whatever good you want for yourself, whether it be financial, whether it be in the material sense, the spiritual sense, you are not a true believer until you want that you want for yourself or another person. And actually, there's another form of that hadith, another narration of it that I was taught about, in that you're not a true believer until you want for somebody else, Muslim or non-Muslim now, that you want for yourself. And there's another hadith as well that I think about, actually, that the ummah is like one body. Yeah, we all know this one. When one part of the body feels pain or feels a fever, the whole body feels it. And when I think about our communities, and I like to say communities plural, because I don't think there is just one Muslim community. There are Muslim communities plural, yeah? when I think about our communities, do we enact that and put it into practice? I don't know if anyone thinks, if you think yes, put your hand up. I want to see if anyone thinks so. Yeah, kind of. I think that's probably more right. That's probably sometimes, but we're selective with it, right? And I think it's something that has really begun to bother me in that we know, for example, when we look at causes like Sudan, right, that has not gotten the support that it has needed. When we look at causes like domestic violence in our community or abuse within our communities, that does not get the support it needs, right? So,
Or mental health.
or mental health,
Literally the whole topic,
exactly, mental health issues as well, right? So people who are, there's a stigma with things like psychosis, schizophrenia, substance misuse, right? Nobody wants to talk about those things. People do not get the support that they need. And it just shows that we're not putting the teachings in our faith to use. And I think a lot of it also stems from ego. A lot of people want to be listened to, but they don't want to listen to others. They're not willing to accept that there is a worldly possibility where I could be wrong. And if you do not approach the conversation with some sort of humility and the ability to know that I may be wrong, it's always going to end up in a clash. And I'm seeing a lot of, like I see on podcasts these days, I see loads of people online, Muslim influence saying, we need to be unified, But being unified takes work. It takes inner work to be able to, I've seen dynamics. For example, an older uncle, let's say South Asian uncle, I'm going to preface it. When I come and speak to him, I'm not from his background, his racial background. The media image of black people is that we stab people and we're hooligans and all this sort of stuff. So if I'm telling him, you're incorrect, and I've had this dynamic play out, basically the response I may get is, who are you to tell me this? Who are you? Or even we can look at it from the convert Muslim perspective to someone who was born Muslim. I've been Muslim longer than you. These things may not always be overtly said, but the feeling is there, the tone is there. It's implied that I am more knowledgeable than you, right? Or, for example, the uncle and like a younger woman, right? And the younger woman says, "Uncle, we need space to pray in the mosque," right? And he's like, "You're a woman, what do you know?" Right? It's the men that run things in this community. And this is not putting into practice our teachings of, if you're a true believer, you would want, a Muslim woman to be able to come and pray freely, right? We've got Muslim women praying in fitting rooms, right? And in every other place other than the mosque, right? This is not communal justice. We're not being just to one another, and it comes from a sense of, I know better. Who are you to question me? I can never be wrong. And actually, this starts to, there are questions of shirk coming into it, in that you are deifying yourself as somebody who is all-knowing and can never be wrong. A minor form of shirk in that is inadvertently, unknowingly, you are putting yourself on a pedestal above others, right? And when we talk about communal justice, if we're going to reach communal justice, we need to learn how to be in community with one another. And that means listening to the other person and accepting, yes, I may be wrong. I may actually learn from you. Just because you're 20, 30 years younger than me, doesn't mean I can't learn something from you. Doesn't mean I can't benefit from you. Doesn't mean we can't have an exchange from one another. And I think moving on to the two examples of, talk about as misogyny and anti-blackness. Just to start off with misogyny. So in my work environment, so Broadmoor is, I think it's 200 men, it's all male patients there. There is a lot of misogyny in terms of hateful and damaging and harmful views towards women. And I think it's important to characterize how those views come about. So 80% of patients, male patients in a high forensic setting, so that's a setting which is like a prison, like Broadmoor is, 80% of them have experienced child sexual abuse, right? And a lot of them have experienced physical violence, verbal violence, You know, if you look at their history, you will see all number of convictions and offences and things, but violence does not come from a vacuum. Assault does not come from a vacuum. Sexual violence does not come from a vacuum. A lot of these individuals, when you read their notes, they watched violence happening in their very homes, right? Their parents abusing, their father abusing their mother, right? And seeing that violence and internalizing that violence. And okay, some of these people may not get to the point where they are even committing crimes or needing to be in hospital or needing to go to prison, but the mind can incubate those thoughts, right? And especially if we're looking now at Muslim men in a time where Islamophobia is rife, in a time where they are struggling to navigate their own identities, there isn't much support in terms of mental health provision, you know, so as well. So things like it's not a man can't say I am depressed and I'm struggling. You know, it's not something that is done. Growing up, I remember if I ever cried, it was a thing of you need to be a man, wipe your tears away. You know, boys don't cry. Right? Those are the kind of things that you hear. And a human being still has emotions, they still have feelings that are not being expressed. And you mix that in with low self-esteem because the society we're living in tells Muslim men or men of color, black men, that you are violent, or you're a terrorist, or you're a thug, or you're a criminal, or you're disruptive. And these negative images are constantly being projected down onto these young men. Eventually, there comes a point where people are yearning for something. They're yearning to feel heard. They're yearning to feel seen. And I think we're also in a time where you also often cannot say what you want to say or express yourself rawly. There are a lot of parameters on what you can't say and what you can say, right? I think some of those can be good in that hate speech, for example. It's important we're not in a society where, although we are in it already anyway, where hate speech is rife, but we are also in a society where people are not allowed to express themselves and build on ideas that they have and to learn and to grow, whether it be politically, whether it be emotionally, for fear of reprieval, for fear of people shouting down on them. And I think we need those places to be able, for people to be able to express and grow and develop. And I see this place as one of those places. And now what the online space has I guess, given room for is for a lot of these toxic opinions. And I mentor young boys and I have for quite some time. And maybe you won't be surprised, but you'll be surprised that all manner of problematic things they say. And at the moment, that's just a normal part, unfortunately, of growing up, is it seeing things online, regurgitating them and taking them as truth. And we need healthy places for those things to be understood first and then gently challenged so that people can grow. And I think we don't have that. And I think what these, I guess, misogynist influencers online have captured is that discontent, is that feeling of low self-esteem, is that feeling of
Powerlessness.
yeah, exactly, powerlessness that people have. And they've captured that and have really intertwined that with a really egotistical narrative that, again, almost deifies men, in that men are better at this and men are supposed to rule and men are supposed to do this. And I think, one example I think we all saw was Andrew Tate, for example. And, I remember when he first became prominent, when the schools I was working with, teachers were saying that this has become a real problem for us. The kind of rhetoric we're seeing spread, that, you can strangle this bitch, apologies for my language, and, F this, you're poor, you can't talk to me until you have money, and even within marriages, by the way, it was causing problems within marriages as well, that kind of violent rhetoric. And I think when we're looking at these issues and we're looking at solving these issues, it's really important to understand some of the root causes. And I think something I've had to learn in my work is actually, when you're faced sometimes with such violent rhetoric, to understand the root cause and then to also come at that with therapeutic gentleness. is really difficult. And I find that in my day-to-day work, there are people who I work with have committed murders, they've committed assaults, rapes, all sorts of things. But I have to contextualize their journey as a whole in order to understand how they got to this point. And I think that's part of communal justice. Because in today's social media age, it's all about who, a type of phrase uses that you need to call people out. I didn't always think calling people out can be useful, by the way, but sometimes you need to be in dialogue and discourse with another person to help them grow. And I think we're not doing enough of that.
Before you go to the next examples, I think, because I really want to add something to that, and why you might see behind me, it says propagators of harm. I always say, in terms of the red pill discourse, or those that are going online saying they're doing dawah, but actually what they're doing is hustle culture. That's what it is.
Extremely, yeah, true.
And I say that their victims are both women and young men. One, and this is not to remove any individual accountability. So I think it's a very, very delicate balance. One part is our young women cannot be victim of the collateral damage to try and support our young men who are feeling powerless. But on the flip side, I do think we need to have a discussion. Who do we need to have discourse with? Who do we need to have this dialogue with? And who's a propagator of harm? And that sometimes helps the call out, call in. So call in is when you have that dialogue to try and build a better narrative, a better conversation. Those values are mentioned earlier on. Call out is at a time when you are like, okay, this cannot be endorsed and there is danger.
Yes, exactly.
So I think that question of the propagators and the person that's doing it, delivering, like Andrew Tate, you might disagree, but he does not need to be called in. I don't care about that. But it's hustle culture. Like, it is hustle culture. So trying to understand, I think, like you said, the background, and from that also making appropriate decisions so we can move forward, or at the very least, for the places that we do trust, we can stay strong. Because these ideas, they're fitness everywhere. They develop like, it blew up. There was a lot of critique of it for a long time, and then it blew up, and then it's kind of now being, called out. But what's happening there is there's going to be another vacuum. So that powerlessness, that lack of nurture, all of these ideas, we're going to be left with another vacuum. And sometimes to do this work and fostering that kind of dialogue that is of benefit is a lot slower. It's a lot longer. It's a lot more tiring. And the results exist, but they're in smaller pockets. So I just really wanted to add that, especially before you go to another.
No. That's really, really important. And I think it also comes back to reorientating ourselves to the prophetic model of justice and what that looks like. And that can be done through looking at the Sirah. It can be done through reading the Quran itself. And I think, I don't know if I might ask this actually. How many of you have read the English version of the Quran? Just put your hands up all the way through. Okay. How many of you have read the Arabic version all the way through and understood it? Keep your hands up. Some hands are kind of coming down. So I think it's actually really important, by the way, as Muslims, we fully read and digest our holy book, because there are so many lessons in there. There are so many verses in there that I cannot bring from my mind, or I cannot say to you now, but are so impactful and powerful and help guide us along these situations that we are struggling with in today's day and age. And I think the prophetic model of masculinity and the prophetic model of justice is really, really important. And I think when we see some of these, Dawah guys online, co-opting the language of our Prophet, peace be upon him, and the language of Islam, I think this is when it becomes even more important to reorientate ourselves and ground ourselves in our faith and religion. Because I don't know about you guys, but there have been times where I have felt like my faith is being hijacked, right, by people who are just using it for views and clicks. And you're right, it is a hustle culture now. And I think even looking at the psychology of that, we're in a time where you say the most controversial thing, that gets more likes, and it gets more comments, and you get people emboldening that. And so it's like a positive feedback loop. You do the same thing over and over, and it's not just about likes, it's also income, right? Income is generated from controversy at the moment. So more and more outlandish views and perspectives are being put out there, and people are being rewarded financially, right? And so I think all of us actually need to start challenging this in our own spheres if we're looking towards communal justice. And I think the other one, which I feel very strongly about because it's personal to me, is anti-blackness. So there was a point where I used to go up and down, like ISOCs all over the country. Sorry, ISOCs all over the country, and I would do lectures on what is blackness from a sort of secular Western perspective and an Islamic perspective. And it got to the point where I actually stopped doing it just because I found it so draining because of what I was hearing from my fellow believers. So people would tell me that, in their family, there was a belief that, black people would not go to heaven, for example. Or one brother came to me and he said he was really ashamed, his family said this, but they told him, when you go to uni, don't make friends with black people, they're bad people, right? There was in Birmingham a few years back, there was a so-called scholar who was on the street telling people, don't be like those black people. I don't know if you guys remember that. Don't be like those black people. Don't be like those black people. And yeah, there's not much more to be said than that we do live, and I think we need to be honest about it, in the Muslim community, there are multiple layers of second-class believers, second, third class, that we're not addressing. It's always nice to talk about, the believers are one body. It's always nice to talk about how we are one ummah, but we don't behave like one ummah. All right, we don't behave like we're one body. And I think, again, I've been in positions where I've tried to challenge organizations or challenge individuals, and there seems to already be like a pre-agreed way of operating. And this isn't just coming from me. I've spoken to black community activists who are double my age, some of them triple my age, who have faced the same problems. When the first, some of the first converts to Islam, Caribbean converts, the repression that they were getting was so much that even parts of their culture were seen as being haram. Anybody heard of a super malt at all? Super malt, yeah?
A little glass bottle drink.
Yeah.
You would have seen it. Yeah.
I remember one of the older converts, he's Jamaican convert, had dreadlocks. He told me that when we first came, the Asian scholars were telling us that this is haram because it's alcohol, it looks like alcohol, right? And you can see now they had to go off and separate and make their own mosques and their own communities, and people have been siphoned off. And it's like, now, no, that's the Pakistani mosque. That's the Somali one, or that's the black mosque, yeah? Or that's the black converts mosque. That's the Turkish mosque. And we've become so siloed and we've become so separated because some people think they are more than others. And this is actually, the way of the pre-Islamic Arabs, right? To think because of your lineage, you are better than somebody, right? In the Prophet, peace be upon him's last sermon, he said, an Arab is not better than an un-Arab, and a black person is not better than a white person. And the only way someone is better than another person, is superior to another person, is piety. And I remember reading that before I converted. I found that so impactful because somebody who is truly pious doesn't even recognize that they are pious. They don't recognize that they don't even recognize the very thing that makes them superior over another person. And many of the prophets are black. Adam, alayhi salam, black. The name Adam means very dark, extremely dark, right? Musa alayhi salam, he was described as being as dark as the two darkest tribes of the Arabs. Sulaiman alayhi salam is described as being black in sources. Isa alayhi salam is described as being black in some sources. And we know there are many, many more prophets that are not named in the Quran who would have been black as well. There are some black companions that people do not know that Ali radiallahu anhu was described in classical texts as being extremely dark. From what has been described, it had been darker than me, actually, right? And you see the way people discriminate towards each other. Imagine they existed at the time of these prophets or companions, peace be upon them. Would they have reacted the same? And coming back to communal justice, and I'll pass on to you after this, we need to get to a point where Muslims of different colors and creeds do not feel threatened by another Muslim who's not from their background telling them that we need to try this or we need to do this. We need to stop the territorial behavior that's going on at the moment. You know, that this is our mosque, or this is our domain. We've worked on this for longer, so this is what's going to run. This is the agenda on this issue, right? We need to, when we think about being a community, we need to be open to one another. We need to be loving and caring to one another. We're not going to be a true ummah until that is the point that we get to. And we often are looking about, you know, countries outside of the UK. What about it, even in London? We haven't even got to a point where we are even a little bit unified in our communities in London. And to be honest, don't get me wrong, it is a big task. You know, bringing so many nationalities and so many people from different backgrounds to one place together is a difficult task. But then I come back to Surah Al-Hujurat, right? A verse in Surah Al-Hujurat which says that we were created in tribes and nations so that we may know one another. Our differences, there's meaning in our differences. Right? And we were created like that in order to get to know one another. But it's incumbent on us to see that difference and not to use it as a point and a wedge within ourselves, but to say this is what connects us. And not even just that, the Islam that we have, this beautiful religion that we have, is what connects us and allows us to work together to a greater vision.
That's really personal to you as well, so thank you for sharing. One thing, so just a couple of things I wanted to add, not too much. Although the examples we've used has been misogyny and anti-blackness, a lot of those themes, they translate, because in 10 years' time, it might be a new problem. I'm not even going to pretend that, yes, in 10 years' time, we've got all the unity we want. But we have to work towards it. We have to aim towards it. That's our duty. And also, something that gives me comfort, and it's going to be weird, but we're not the first people to face courage. Sometimes there is this idea of this unresolvable, unsolvable problem, and it can really weigh you down. And I think the other thing that weighs us down, and why one of the reasons we don't ever do the events online, is it's falling, we're isolated. We're very separated from each other, we're very isolated, so we might be having experiences like that, and then isolated from the rest of our community, and all we're seeing are the worst parts. I also really like the Quran ayah you chose, so I put one up there just about the forbidding of oppression. And even for the psyche, sometimes you do have to look towards that which is motivational, which is of benefit. And that's the perfect litmus test. Would I want this for myself? When we talk about expanding empathy and having the courage to stand for right, because on the communal it's slightly different. So we've spoken about systems. This is where it's really about us as individuals, what we take out, what we have to. And I'm going to say it to you, brothers, I am going to highlight the brothers, of when it comes to red pill rhetoric, are you the ones that are accounting it and closing it down? And same with anti-blackness. Like I said, there's the intersections. Do we have blind spot? Someone recently asked me in terms of what work have you done to understand these things? What's the work? How do you keep yourself aiming to be centered on justice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That bit's really important. And I think another thing that's really important is never presume you've done the work. You know what you're saying about being open to the other views that come in and finding that way to listen, the things that you might be missed. Never presume the work is done. As long as you're always going with curiosity and care, and the ayah is a brilliant way to show you how to care. Would I want it for myself? It is continual. And then we build. You build with one Lego, right? And then you have several Legos. And my nephew's got a whole starship made of Legos, but he had to start with the one. But those questions, again, I think to guide us, keep it on your phone, write it down. Because sometimes the thoughts come to us when we are isolated. As much as I love that we're in a room together and we're having this conversation, I know many people are going to go to Monday and they're going to go to work in a secular place. They might go back to family settings where it's not really understood what we're discussing. We might be the only person we might be in the Pakistani or the Bangladeshi mosque and coming across this, and you're having to do it very, very, in a really lonely way to some extent. So that's why we always try and put some kind of reflective questions that maybe you can go back to as a way to ground ourselves with God, what was mentioned about the Quran. I think definitely like keeping a seerah to hand, but ways that in between, in that isolation, what can break up? Just a little bit, just a bit of guidance. So, the next one, because we don't want to leave everyone in a case of the world is in tatters, and that is all. We don't do nihilism. What do we do? What is a step to build? But I realize I jumped. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Eunice, please.
On the topic of misogyny and pushing the young boys in the community, obviously you said that you've mentored a lot of young boys. Given your experiences, do you signpost them to any influences that are a positive influence? Obviously you mentioned a lot of negative influences.
Yeah. To be honest, I don't think there's that many at the moment. There are books and resources, but in terms of influencers whose content is specialized for that, there aren't many, to be honest. And I feel like when I mentor them, I usually am trying to be the person who's giving them those positive influences. And I think some of them, with these young boys, we call it like theory of mind, right? The understanding of another person's thoughts and feelings. They don't. It sounds bizarre, but sometimes the way they see women and young girls, they don't even think that they feel, or they see them as objects, right? They don't think that they may have feelings or emotions regarding this thing, or if they do know they have those things, they see them as insignificant or something that can be dismissed. So I think it's really, in my experience, I've tried to sensitize them to those feelings and thoughts of others. And again, like we've been talking about, how would you feel if it was done to you? Do you see what I mean? Like switching it up, and over time, like that gradual sensitization to that does help, I would say. Yeah.
What I'm going to add to that is, I think in the references there will be some signposting. But I think one of the issues is we think it's like for like. So we've got these bad influences, now we need the great influences. What if the problem was that all these conversations are happening online and online only in the first place? So my experience is really odd because I do similar work to you, but doing it as a woman. Because the conversation comes up in my service room with those that I'm, like the therapy room, with those that I'm, giving therapy to, but simultaneously because of the events organization, it also comes up in the community. And one thing I always say is that it happens in the grassroots. And that's one of the reasons we don't see a change. The online amplifies the worst in the popular spaces. So yes, we want better influences. This is an excuse of like, let's not have better things online. But that can't be the only thing. And that's one of the problems. So we also need to support, to kind of find what's happening in the grassroots and support that. What are ways we can support them? Can we give them more space? Can we support with money? Advocacy is the one that we say we want organization and change, but the organizations that are working on the ground, actually, it's really difficult to get charity for them compared to where it's a case of, like we said, globally, someone's poor, I need to give money. I understand why that feels like a priority need, but if we're talking about organizing and change, then advocacy at home is also important. And it's going to be so. That's just it. There's no magic fix. And I think that's an important thing. And then also the family home. The family home. I'm sure you will have cousins, you will have nephews. Sometimes we get quite, not lost, but kind of the strategy in tying our cam on. And I get it. It's coming from a space of frustrations. It's coming from a space of being collectively traumatized of why are we not doing better. But I think sometimes we need to also have a bit of empathy for ourselves and our community of where we're at, and it will be slower, and we're in a world that actively works towards illness. Well, that's what it does. And I'm not talking about physical health or mental health illness. I'm talking about actual diseases of the soul. So it's going to be slower. Where are we going to start and how we participate in that way? And it starts from the home as well. So that's kind of, I know I keep on highlighting the brothers, and you know what? I don't even feel bad about it. You've got cousins, you've got nephews, so be present. Be a different narrative.
I think that's a really important point. I think it is difficult to do that all the time. I don't know if you would agree. I think what you're talking about is proportionality, which is in our faith really, really important. So when I've done past talks, I've always asked people to think about when it came to, so it's called Race and Revelation, the talk I used to do. So looking at how blackness, what does it mean as a concept, and how does it relate to revelation and Islam, is like this kind of looking at proportionality. So was the person intentionally doing it, or were they being malicious, or were they just ignorant and they said it off the cuff? Not to say that that makes it any worse, but it helps you temper the way you respond to that individual. I do think that some people's egos are so big they can't be sidestepped. But I feel like, yes, we should try and reason with people. And that's difficult, by the way. That takes a lot of work, a lot of energy. And I think in the day and age we live in, like we were talking about, it's call out, call out. And from sort of zooming out, I have seen sometimes where calling out people in that very like, direct and like, in that theatrical way even, can actually deepen them in their disposition. And it sometimes makes me wonder if we kind of, like you said, sidestep that ego, would we have gotten another response? But then I think there are also some personalities that people have tried this thing with them, the kindness, compassion, and to try and reason with them. And they've, we're looking at your grifters, your people who make money off this stuff and they enjoy spreading hate. I feel like those people need that robust. This is not to change your mind. This is not to bring you on side. This is to show others that it's not acceptable to follow what you're following. But I think a balance and case-by-case judgment of situation is needed. So, yeah.
And it goes, some do, you need to starve the oxygen. I think when there's an active harm, that kind of calling in is more difficult because we can't place groups in the way of active harm. So we had, I know the sister. Okay, so I'm going to go.
Was there someone up front?
Yeah, there was Solomon, but he was after the sister, sorry. So for everyone that didn't hear that, this is why I need you guys to make comments because that slipped my mind. Jazakallah khair. What the sister was saying is that recognizing anti-blackness and that it's not just an interpersonal issue, it is a systemic issue, and that's trickling down into our communities. Now, we can address the interpersonal, but I think that we can't avoid where it comes from. And one of the most damaging, so an example of that would be stop and search. Stop and search, where young black men are stopped and searched. And I recently saw a statistic, I can't remember the exact, but I'll put it on here, where nearly about close to the majority of white men who are stopped and searched do have drugs on them, compared to the majority of young black men who are stopped and searched do not have anything on them. And taking it back to mental health, these are the traumas that build. These are the complex traumas. So thank you for making that link, sis.
And I'm going to take it 2 at a time because of timing.
No worries, Jazakallah khair for that point. I think it is really important. Usually, when I do talk about this, I don't know if anybody's heard of eugenics at all. Hands up if you've heard of it. That's great, that's great. So for those who don't know, eugenics essentially is a pseudoscience, and it essentially means good stock. So there's positive eugenics, essentially breeding people together that have good characteristics, which is white, able-bodied, and of higher class. And negative eugenics, which is stopping those breeding who have negative traits, so not white, disabled, and lower class. And this was actually housed at UCL, which is the institution I used to go to. And so this was, I call the people who invented eugenics. So Francis Galton was the originator of eugenics, and he was actually the cousin of Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, who we always hear about in biology, actually supported this as well, this movement. And Immanuel Kant as well, another like famous philosopher. If you do philosophy or religious studies, you'll never hear about him being involved. And these are some of the names that were really involved in pumping out. I've read some of their books, for example, the way they describe, for example, black people as not having a full brain, for example, not being a full human being. These people were connected to government. Winston Churchill was a vice president of the British Eugenics Society. John Maynard Keynes, and I'm giving you a lot of names, right? He is the modern father of economics, right, in America. he was part of the American Eugenics Society. So you've got economists, scientists, biologists, mathematicians. They all came together over these thoughts and opinions that, people who aren't white, black people, were not proper human beings. They would ask questions of, did they have a soul, for example? And so this funding and this knowledge was really pumped into communities, not just in the UK, but around the world of colonialism. So, sister, I really appreciate you saying what you said, because it is important that we bring light to the fact that this is a global institutional industry, and it still exists today in different forms and in different ways and in different names. So we do enact discriminations on one another. Anti-blackness is enacted by people, but it didn't just start with individual people. It started through systems and it's propagated through systems. So Jazakallah khair for that reminder.
Just to piggyback off that, because obviously the last 2 years there's been a lot of conversation about dehumanization of those under occupation. That stems from this. And we've seen a lot of people come and say, oh, think about the children and women in Palestine. Or like we said, the Western feminist about we need to save the oppressed woman. That's because of this idea that has amplified since 9/11 through counter, so on the systematic level, through the prevent agenda. So this is in law, this is in policy, to counter terror, to essentially make the Arab or brown man the terrorist. So it really goes through into every nook and cranny of what we experience, and then it trickles down into the ways that we treat each other. And I think Sister Nora that mentioned earlier, that when you understand this, you can kind of take a step back and see the forest for the trees. So sis in the green scarf, you had the hand up? Someone had a hand up between you two? No? Okay, so we're going to take, So I'm going to take the brother, I'm going to take you. Because of time, I'm going to take it together. So, go on, Salman. Well, for those that didn't hear, what the sister was mentioning is that most of us, we are marginalized or victimized in some way, especially as Muslims. Right now, I don't think anyone can say Islamophobia doesn't exist. So why can't, and her question was, or a kind of a test, a self-test of, I can understand this for me, I can look at, and this is the reason actually why we chose 2 examples, because the idea should be transferable. So the sister was saying, if I can understand this for me as a Muslim under the system experiencing Islamophobia, I should be able to step into someone else's shoes, have that empathy for sisters, for someone that's black, whatever it may be, for someone with mental health issues, for someone with substance issues, to understand that the system impinges on us all. And before the last part, also in terms of what was being said by Suleiman earlier about the punching up versus punching down, I always use the rule of good satire. In terms of good satire is when you are punching up. That's when it's actually funny. When you're punching down, it's bullying. That's like a simple rule of satire and comedy. When you are punching down, I would add that it's shame masking. I don't feel I can make the change, so I'm going to go highlight. And sometimes it happens very insidiously. I don't think every single person is set out to do this as like a great evil thing. It comes about from all of these, what you were saying earlier, like how do we have these conversations? How do we start that discourse? But again, it's a way to ask that question. And inshallah, we'll be doing some events on power structures and where the counter narrative, which takes us to the last bit. Because not every day, just everything is bad, that's it, go home. What we want to look at is, what do we do next? We've come to this room, okay, but what's next? How do you build a counter narrative? How do you embed social justice in spaces of mental health? And also, again, going back to that clarity we brought about. So this diagram behind me, interestingly, came out in more leftist spaces. I'm usually not a huge fan of them, but there's a great body of literature. And it simplifies of what are the roles. So when you're building a movement, when you're looking to change, I know there's a sister that was mentioning about on the ground, can change come or not, and individually, where the individuals. Because when these conversations are being had, it's always a case of, now I see it. The whole point of today was to get the awareness, the clarity of these issues. Now I say, now what am I going to do? Again, putting the person back. But it's supposed to be a case of what are we supposed to build? What are we going to do? And many people are already doing it without knowing. And I really like some of the names here. And I'm not saying to follow this model, I just thought it's a very good visual. Because in Islam, we already have not just the values and the principles, but kind of the actions. And I think what you mentioned about when you go back to the Quran and Sunnah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He guides you. He guides that critical thinking. He guides that heart. And support, what I said earlier, like, please get the support if you need it. Yes, we come to this earth alone and we leave it alone, but He has been kind enough to give us rizq in the community where we find Him. How do we utilize that? I'm going to just pick on a couple of these things, just to break down what it means to be over these various roles. I really liked caregivers, because I think sometimes when it comes to social justice, we don't acknowledge caregivers as much, or they're not part of the strategy. Whereas caregivers can be not only critical, but the vital support to have that resilience. And I'm going to connect them to the disruptors. Is everyone aware of the PAL action protest right now, where PAL action was prescribed they have been closing down weapons factories as a way of, challenging Israel and UK's genocide. So they're the disruptors. The disruptors need the caregivers. And when you're in activist circles, you see everyone slips into a role. So right now, after Palestine Action got prescribed, every few days, once a month, there will be people, elderly people, my mum's in the room, people older than her, that will go and hold up a sign that says, I support PAL action, which now is an act of terrorism by law. And they're arrested. So they are the disruptors. The question is, we allowed them for disrupting and we often revere, but around that, there's so many things we can do. And at different moments in time, we're going to need different things to do. And then the idea is a coming together of that makes the movement. So with those disruptors, what happens each protest is there's a witness block. They, I would say, are the caregivers, both the witnesses and the caregivers. And sometimes we can think a lot about strategy and outcomes, but it can actually move us away from the human part of it, the ummah part, that we also have to honor each other as what, the ayah of one, if the limb is hurting, the rest of the body fevers. That is also an outcome. An outcome isn't necessarily just this huge, big, fat change. Of course we want that. We want oppression to stop. We want injustices to stop. But those subtle acts of resilience, of not buying into this system, is also a particular change. It's a change in the socio-cultural. When generations come, that upholds these values. Like, let us not be naive to think that Islam, the Islamic values, they just remain. They uphold it, which is why with the caregivers, it always stands out, because that's your cousins and your nephews, your aunts and your sisters, the parents. There's a role for everybody, and let's not diminish that. Because sometimes I think we internalize the shame so much that we think we're not part of it. We are. It's just how can we connect the way. And it's also going to change when you are there. And I put a few questions because I have people come to me, and obviously they ask what next, or just that kind of feeling of despair. The sadness is understandable, but the despair is where we have to bring it back to the fact that Allah is the outcome. We do not despair. We've been told about that. We have tech. I don't do my own tech. That's a perfect live example of coming together, because that's the only way it can be done. And upholding the social culture is also an outcome. I think sometimes because the world at present is so about the socio-political, everything is political, we omit some of the other outcomes, and it really impacts the psyche. So there's a few questions here of understanding what could I do, and they're just guiding questions. This isn't hard fact. I just really liked it, and we always like to end on motivation, on where can we build from, on care. What might my community need now? What support can I provide to what is already happening? Where is my capacity limited? Do I have the means to expand my capacity? What can I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this moment for aid? And sometimes actually it's shame and hopelessness that removes us from that conversation. So are there ways of having those conversations with God, our Lord, that moves us forward? And that's not going to feel hunky-dory, just to let you know. Like, we're not going to be like, yeah, that's it, I've done it, I'm happy now. But maybe it's going back right to the beginning and redefining our definition of well-being. And this life is a duality. There is a balance. Unfortunately, there is great distress, but there is also great resilience. And how do we find a way to navigate this life, to continue and to live, to do our duties, but also to take of the immense rizq that Allah SWT has given us, and oftentimes in each other.
I think we're closing now, isn't it? This is probably the last few comments.
Few comments on the closing, yeah.
Yeah, I think just to leave it on a positive note, I think it's really important to actually reflect on Allah's names. And I think I was talking about before, everyone has something that they gravitate towards. And I think the name I most gravitate towards is Al-Hakam, the judge. Sorry. Coming down with a cold. Al-Hakam, the judge, is one that I always focus on. And I think in my journey as a professional, mental health professional, psychiatrist, and as an activist, organizer, whatever you want to call it, I think coming off of that, like the roles we could all inhabit, I think it's important to recognize our limits. And I don't mean that in that, oh yeah, just give up, you can't do anything. But I think when you're feeling spiritually and mentally burnt out, and I think often they're quite intertwined. So this may start to appear as, you're missing your salahs, or you're praying like at the last minute, or, you're not making up your fast when you need to, or, you're not spending some time making dua to Allah, for example. All these little things which allow our souls to connect to our Creator, right? I went through a period where this was a few years ago when I was an elected student officer. I was at every protest. I was at every event. I was speaking up and down the country. And I was just all over the place, like spiritually, mentally. Like, my salahs, I was literally praying them like at the last minute, and you're just rushing. I'm sure we've all had that when we've really focused on, like, I need to pass this policy, or I need to get this material thing done. And that has its importance, but God has created us with a purpose, which is to worship Him. And everything else comes after that. After your rights to God comes your rights to yourself. I'm really terrible for this, but sleeping, for example, I didn't sleep very well. But taking care of your regime, your eating habits, right? Saying no to things, right? How many of us have been really exhausted and someone's given us an opportunity and we should have said no, but we said yes, and now we're knackered after doing it. Shamoly, I'm looking at you as well.
All right, Ayo.
I know you've done that as well.
No, so he's complaining about being here.
No, I'm not. But it's something that we all do, right? Learning to say no is really important, because when we say yes, we can come to it with more energy. And then also taking care of your family. So when I was running around doing all these protests, I barely saw my family, like barely. We were living in the same house, but I was not spending time with them, right? And then the community comes after. There's actually a hadith which talks about structuring things in that sense as well. A companion called Salman actually came to Prophet ﷺ, and they talked about this, right? You can look it up, that hadith. So there's a way to structure things within yourself in order to do things healthily, right? In order to give everything its rights as they should be given. And one of my biggest lessons is that we can't inhabit the names of Allah, for example. So I used to be the one, I wanted to bring about justice, especially when you've been wronged personally, or even with what's going on in Israel, right? Seeing what they're doing to Palestinians, like, I was like, I need to sacrifice myself. I need to do something. Like, I need to put myself on the line. And again, this is not an excuse to say, just sit at home and just retweet or repost and don't do anything. No. What it is actually, it means you cannot control every outcome. Dua is really important. Dua is the weapon of the believer. Actually, sometimes realizing your limitations allows you to keep on fighting. I was in a point where I was probably, the way I was is that I thought I could be the judge. I thought I could bring about justice. And this leads to burnout and overwhelming yourself, because we cannot inhabit divine attributes, if that makes sense, and learning to rely on Allah, learning to rely on God within these situations. You know, I've actually for a few years now, I actually haven't read books on slavery and things like that, because it's so overwhelming for me, right? And in those times when I really struggled with the histories of my people that happened, I relied on God. And I trusted him that with what I'm seeing today and with what we have seen in the past, that he truly will bring divine justice. Each of you will have that way of connecting with God and with faith yourself, and it is so important to do so. And that actually you will reach the purest and strongest forms of faith. There's a verse in Surah Baqarah which talks about whoever has grabbed onto Allah has grabbed onto the firmest handle that there is. And that is really what we've got, to safeguard our spirits and our minds, where so much, we've talked about, there's so much going on around us and so much we want to do, but God needs to be at the center of that, and we've spoken about the different ways we can do that, but I think just please think about yourselves. I think sometimes we're not kind to ourselves, and it feels wrong to do that when we see other people suffering, but we are people too. And we have rights, and Allah has given us rights, and Allah cares for us, and we should care for ourselves. So that'll be my last contribution, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. I'm going to wrap up unless someone has like a burning comment or question, just to allow us a bit of time to kind of ground ourselves out. It's been a lot of heavy conversations, and also time to speak to each other. We've still got the room for a little bit longer. I guess my closing remarks would be, I get that from people a lot who come, just how heavy it feels with everything going on in the world and how guilty they feel for looking after themselves. But it goes back to that key note that you ended on, purpose. What is the purpose? Like, we don't amplify what we're doing and thinking that, yeah, I've done enough, that's it, it's sufficient. It evidently is not. But simultaneously, let's not diminish on the other side of the things that we do. And it's why I keep talking about puzzle pieces. And because it's a coming together. And oftentimes, I'm sure many people in the room, we're doing it. It's about recognizing it. This event, Ayo and I, we're facilitating, but the scaffolding behind it is not just Ayo and I. And I'm not even talking about just the volunteers today. So it's like, how does that work come about? And I hope those questions are a little bit of a guiding point for you. So as we wrap up, now I need a favor from everyone in the room. I need a favor. Before you leave, that first QR code, it is feedback. Hear me out. Please fill it in. Now, feedback is something that we often overlook, but at my own organization, Hoque, and I know Ayo as well, and those with Inspirited Minds who we've been speaking to, we're taking it really serious, the idea of a collaborative approach, ground up, organizing to support and provide a framework of social justice. So, we want to put our money where the mouth is, sort of thing, that if we're discussing this, we want to facilitate that to the extent that we can, as much as we can. We need your feedback. What worked well? What needs development? The hope is even that maybe in the future doing this specifically to students, to parents, to practitioners. It's just a few minutes. Really appreciate that. I also want to say, we didn't delve into it, but those stats at the beginning about mental health. There are many people that are going through it. Please do seek support if you need that, professional support. Inspirited Minds, they do provide, they have a lot of blogs, a lot of free awareness tools, podcasts, and they also have a therapy service, which it is based on your socioeconomic. So if you, because another thing that we struggle with is getting access to service. Please take some, there should be some books, leaflets, so have a check of the store, check the stall out. They're on Instagram as Inspirited Minds. When I send the email out, we will have all those details. Even if not for yourself, I do suggest bookmarking their page. You don't know when you might need that help, or you may come across somebody. And it's going back to keeping things within our own remit. And so, please do. Now, the middle one, the QR codes, is Ayo. So if you want to hear more of his insightful work and thoughts, that is his Substack. Follow it. You can always find him on Instagram as Ayo Khalil. For those that don't know, Substack is a email newsletter. That's the best way to describe it. You can subscribe and it comes into your email, or you can go on there and find out. And then the pink one is Hoque Substack. So that's me, guys. That's for events. If you want to come to more events where we're looking at social cultural, and it's not just going to mental health. If you want to stay up to date with what we plan to do from off the back of this, also we've done educational stuff. We've done Kashmir. There's a project working on that. There will be an Islamophobia conference coming up. So if you check out Hoque, follow and subscribe, you will have access to all the slides as that will go out on there. Inshallah, in 2 weeks, give me a bit of time, taking that rest that you mentioned, and all the upcoming events. Inshallah. So again, thank you so much for attending. I really pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not only accepts it from us, He rewards us, but it allows to be an action to a longer term path. And that this gathering is surrounded by angels, and our most beautiful gathering is in Jannah al-Firdaus. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum everybody. Have some more tea before you leave.